Good morning, everyone. I'm going to jump in and I'm going to try to leave room so that we can have some discussion at the end. But I want to just set the groundwork, set expectations, and I love setting them low, right? Because then you're bound to succeed. But no, just so that you know what to expect. So Bruce was really kind when he reached out and he said, well, you could give a presentation on research that you're doing, or you could give something that's broader, that's about a trajectory you've been on or some things you've been thinking. And of course, I opted for the latter. I give talks about specific research papers or specific research projects all the time. I've been giving a bunch of them recently. I have a book that just came out, book talks all over the place, so on and so forth. Oh my goodness. Thank you all are very sweet. I promise I was not fishing for applause, but I'll take it anyway. And so what I don't get as much of an opportunity to do, and I would imagine many of us don't get quite as much of an opportunity to do, is to kind of talk about how I've been thinking about my work, what I've been learning, what trajectory I've been on, and sort of bring a broader perspective to the path I've been on as a scholar and in my sort of intellectual journey. And so I'm going to do that, which means you're not going to get the neat, like, and here is what my research question is, and here is what my data was, and so on and so forth. You got some data and some things thrown in there, but just buckle up because it's not going to be our standard process here. Hopefully it will be more fun and interesting than that. I don't know. I can't promise that. But it is 9 a.m., so I figured I'd try to keep us on the more engaging track if possible. Okay, so I don't know if this is moving. Oh, maybe I'm supposed to, there we go. I think it was moving, all right. So I'm gonna start here, which is symbolic and probably feels, maybe, if you're in the space I'm in, it feels right. It feels about right to you. If you're in a different space, maybe you're like, no, US democracy, it's not crumbling. And if so, we should talk. I really wanna know, I wanna take whatever you're taking. Or at least have a sense of how you're understanding and thinking about the world. And I will confess to never having been terribly optimistic about the state of US democracy. It's not like I've ever been like, yeah, we are an amazing democratic polity that is a shining light in the world. I know maybe some people have been at that place before. That was not my starting point, right? But even from a starting point of recognizing how fundamentally and perennially there have been really deep issues with this polity as we know it, with its settler colonialism and white supremacist roots right on down, even starting from that point and having that deep knowledge, I have still found myself in the last several years being struck by how low it seems we are going. And I keep finding myself saying to people, I don't know where the bottom is. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're there yet. And so it's a lot to be a political scientist in this moment, in this milieu, and to have something to say to people that is even the least bit positive or optimistic, and I already am a cynic by nature, it's challenging. And that is for good reason, right? I'm not the only one who feels this way. Most people are steadily losing confidence in major U.S. institutions like Congress and the Supreme Court and so on and so forth, as they rightfully, I would say, should be. I'll flag that as my opinion, but I don't think that the average American being picked up by Gallup poll here is crazy. I think there's a reason why people are losing confidence in U.S. institutions. And they're losing confidence in democracy, right? They don't think that democracy, many people don't believe democracy in the U.S. is working the way that it ought to be working. I don't think the baseline, this goes back to 1984. I don't think the baseline is ever really very high, which is striking to me, but it has fallen even lower, right? So starting off in a place of kind of perennial and deep disconcertedness around the kind of nature and structure and outcomes of U.S. democracy, and just going down from there. And in a way, what we see reflected in public opinion, it resonates very much for me. And I'm not a big public opinion person, so this isn't like data I collected. It's just Gallup poll data sitting out there. Any of us can see, right? And I would argue that part of the reason why people feel this way is not just, two reasons. One is part of what democracy is about is our sense that however true or false this is, our sense that we have a say, right? And more people actually don't think this is true. When you ask people if they feel like citizens can have some kind of influence over what happens in democratic politics, the US is actually one of the countries relative to our what we might consider whom we might consider our peers, which that is contestable, we are not doing well, right? A lot of people in the US don't think that actual people, ordinary denizens, have much of a say in what happens in our democracy. And who do they think has a say? Well, people with money, campaign donors, lobbyists, right? So folks at the top, not everyone else. And so this is part of what I think fuels and feeds the consternation over the kind of nature of our democracy, but it's not all, right? Another part of what I think feeds that consternation is what people experience in their day-to-day life, which is pretty massive and striking and very much felt, palpable for many people, not equally and not in the same ways, but palpable kinds of inequality. Whether we think about that inequality in terms of income and wealth, the fact that a very few people are accounting for a large share of all the income that is being earned or all the wealth that is being held in this country, right? That top 10%. And actually, if we broke that down more, it would be like the top 1% of the 1% that really was holding almost everything. And especially if you look at wealth, what's left for bottom 50 is a lot of people, right? And it's just barely anything, right? And this is something that, it's numbers on a graph, but people are feeling this in their lives, right? And they feel in all sorts of ways. They feel it when they're looking for a home or an apartment to rent, when they're trying to survive, when they're trying to pay their mortgage or their rent. And that has become more and more impossible and difficult over time for many people, and not equally so, I will say, right? And people are experiencing hardships across all sorts of metrics. Everything from keeping a roof over your head to keeping the utilities on, to paying the bills month over month. And I keep saying this, but just to emphasize, everyone, many people, not everyone, but many people are feeling hardship, are experiencing the kind of pain of economic strain. But in particular, Black and brown people, people of color, they're feeling it and experiencing it in a deeper way, in a more acute way, and not accidentally, not incidentally, but systematically because of structural choices that we continue to make. So this is the landscape that we operate in. And I was telling Bruce Western this as we were coming in, just given what I study, and probably many people in this room can understand this, it's like a lot of talks are pretty depressing. It's like poverty, racism, and that is the world. And I'm not interested in masking it. So, in fact, part of our role is to unmask. So that's fine. I'm not opposed to giving talks that are on the depressing side. But I have been on a trajectory in my own learning as a scholar, as a person, actually, and in my own research, especially over the last 6 or 7 years, that has opened my eyes in a way that they weren't open before, to a level, to an extent that they weren't open before, to another set of possibilities. And so that's really what I want to focus on today. So I start with this stuff around the state of our, and I would say the failing and the frazzled and the inadequate state of our democracy and of our economy, right? And of what people are getting, what they're getting from the polity and what they're getting materially as a starting point, but it's not where I want to stay. So yes, there is a brokenness built into, I would say, the foundation of our politics and our economy in this country. And it, what maybe at points was visible cracks is now, it's really obvious the depth and the extent of the brokenness. But there's more than that, right? And so what I want to talk about and what I want to lift up and surface today is that there are real promising possibilities for us to have something that we can call a democracy without caveat. Does anybody else caveat? I'm like, ostensible democracy. Like, I really overuse the word ostensible, and usually before democracy, or putative, right? That's another one of my go-tos, because it feels like you have to put something in front of that word because there are so many communities, so many people, so many places to whom it doesn't feel relevant, really never did, but certainly does not now, right? And even in the midst of that, that there are some promising possibilities, and that it's worth paying attention to where these possibilities are coming from, where they're growing, where they're building, because it's happening at the margins. And this is a room where we actually care about the margins. The person who trained me to think about, and in terms of marginality, is sitting in the room. So I can confidently say I think this is a room where we care about this. But all of the inertia of the horse race politics that we're watching on TV, whatever we're reading in the New York Times or the Washington Post or many of our preferred outlets, whatever we're seeing on CNN or MSNBC or our preferred media, whatever we're scrolling on Blue Sky or I hope not X, friends, but maybe TikTok. My kids try to show me TikTok stuff, and I'm like, nope, that time has passed for me. But whatever our outlets are, wherever we're seeing and absorbing, whatever it is that we're seeing and absorbing, inertia is actually pushing us to look anywhere but at the margins. We're being pushed to obsess over the elites. Elon Musk is a trillionaire. Donald Trump is all we can see everywhere all the time. His lackeys, all of the people at the top, the people in fact who are responsible for the crumbling of democracy, at least in this current moment, and who are benefiting from its long-standing flaws and being grossly enriched by it, that is where so much of our energy can lie. And if it's not there, then it's like often at this kind of broad, the public, everyone, we're looking everywhere. And when we look at everyone everywhere, it's sort of, we can see everyone everywhere looking up at all the craziness happening among the elites. And some of those analyses are so important, right? So I'm not saying we don't pay attention to public opinion or the public, or that we don't pay attention to political elites. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that there is something that's always been at the margins and that I've seen in ways that I hadn't seen before that I think is growing, and I think it's promising. And this is the only place where I have been able to be hopeful and optimistic and positive about democracy over the last several years, which is why I've been writing all these pieces. People are like, you've been so obsessed with some of the work you're doing around, which I'll talk about, around organizing and, I'm moving too fast. I'm pressing the buttons in the wrong way. That's all right. Around organizing and power and the margins, right? I mean, it's really just like beating this drum. And why? It's not that I'm not attentive to the world as it is, right? So a lot of my research is still focused on the systems and the structures that are purveyors of racism, that are perpetuating poverty and economic inequality, whether it's through our social policy or through healthcare policy or through legal policies. These are all areas that I focus on, right? And often the takeaways from my research in those areas, which I still do and will continue to do, but often the takeaways are about, or they underscore, things that are real and true and that we need to know, but that are fundamentally disempowering and that are fundamentally stories about deficits in marginalized communities, or about ways that they are being harmed by our systems, our structures, or they're being failed by those systems and those structures. Now, we can't ignore that and sacrifice it on the altar of false optimism. That's not a strategy, right? And so I continue to do that research, and we should too, right? But there's more than this. When we only focus on the ways that systems and structures are harming and marginalizing people, we really forget about their agency and about the possibilities that lie in those communities, right? And so I've been really fortunate in the course of doing some of that research about those systems and structures to come across a set of people who are actively resisting the conditions that are being created for them by the structures that they're embedded in, right? And this has really happened for me in, I would say, 3 main spaces of my research. So one is a space where a lot of my research lies, which is in the healthcare space. And Actually, one of my frustrations as a scholar of Medicaid over the last several years has been the focus in that space on policy and elite machinations, right? Medicaid expansion, or what's happening with the ACA, or even the way that Medicaid is experienced on the ground in actual agencies by actual people. Often we can focus on this through the lens of what folks who have relatively more power are doing, what strings they're pulling, what levers they're pulling, how they decide to design policies. All of those things are very important. Some of that research is research I'm doing, so I'm not saying that it's not important. But the actual people who are being affected are often understood to be sort of passive subjects. Things are happening to them. Things are happening to them, right? And that's true in the health space. We can think about things that way in a space I've been doing a lot of work around in the last few years in terms of the civil legal spaces, right? I've been looking at people's experiences in housing court, thinking about tenants and people who rent their homes and the conditions they're facing, and how the institutions they're embedded in can shape the material realities of their lives. And housing courts, much like Medicaid agencies, much like a lot of the places that we might think of structure the lives of the people who are at the margins, are like sad and depressing places to live, right? So whether we're thinking about healthcare or legal institutions, or even work that I've been doing on other kinds of social policies, right? Understanding people's experiences with child tax credits, or understanding people's experiences with, low-income housing assistance and so forth. In all of these spaces, if we think about the institutions, what's happening within them and how they're structuring people's lives, it often does not feel like there's much room to really believe that those people who are navigating and being affected by those institutions can do something to change them. Now, of course, in theory, we all believe that, right? But in practice, we often don't behave as though we believe it. And by we, I'm talking about me. I'm not pointing the finger at you. I'm saying this is where I've been, right? So I've been on my own learning journey. And I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of details around research, but I will say in the past 5 years, across these different spaces that I've just narrated for you, I've done more than 400 in-depth semi-structured interviews and or focus groups, or talked to more than 400 people in either interviews and focus groups. And different kinds of people from different spaces, right? People who are renting their homes, people who have experiences with a variety of different kinds of policies, and people, and this has been the group I would say that has probably influenced me the most, people who are actively organizing to push back and fight against the structures of these systems as they are, right? So to not just be passively affected by institutions, but to be actively changing them. And these are the folks, this last category of folks, who have helped me to think about what it means to exercise power, even from the margins, in very different ways than I had been thinking about it before. Now, there's no point at which you would have asked me, do you think ordinary people can make a difference? And I would have been like, no way, But there's certainly points where if you asked me that, and then I said, yeah, sure, and you said, well, how? What does that actually look like? Where do you see it happening? What places? What groups? Who? And if it's not happening, how can it actually happen? I would not have had answers to those questions, right? Which is to say, it was a vague faith that somehow ordinary people, especially marginalized people, have agency and power and matter, but nothing more than a vague faith, right? Nothing really undergirding that. But this work that I've done talking to people from all different backgrounds, all across the country, experiencing all different kinds of things, not with a causal question in mind, not to show you that if you do X, you can get people to do Y. That's really important. And we need to ask and answer causal questions, just to be clear. But that's not what I have been doing with much of this work. Instead, my primary goal has been rich, thick, informative description. What is happening? We can't even get to the why until we understand the what. Where is it happening? Among who is it happening? And what does it mean? What are the meanings that people attach to what they're experiencing? And what does that tell us about the possibilities for how they move in the world and how they can create change in the world? These are the kinds of questions I've been asking. There's like a bunch of, this encapsulates a bunch of different studies and research projects, but I'm just summarizing here. For the most part, at the beginnings of my conversations with people, when I ask them to tell me about what's going on in their lives, this is essentially a summary of the kinds of things I learn, right? Because I'm talking to mostly low income, in or near poverty, Black, brown, women, exactly the people who we know to be struggling the most now, and really have always been struggling the most, but it's certainly not getting any better. I'll give you a few examples. We won't linger here for long. I mentioned that I had been doing some work in the housing space, and I'll give you some examples from that space. This is a woman that I talked to in upstate New York. Her name isn't Aria, but I call her Aria. Her name does start with an A. And she was telling me, I met her this day in a housing court where I had been doing some ethnographic observation, and I saw what happened to her with her court case. She was evicted that day. And as she was leaving the courtroom, I asked her if she had time to talk, and if she wanted to talk. She really wanted to talk. And she said at some point during our conversation, she's telling me about her slumlord, her living conditions. She actually came to court with all the evidence one could possibly have. She had pictures, she had videos. She showed me the video of her walking through her home with the big crack in the wall and the mold and horrible, really inhumane living conditions. And she doesn't know what to do. She talks about being depressed. She talks about her son being sick because Aria hadn't had heat in her home for the past few winters. This is upstate New York. It gets incredibly, incredibly cold. And freezing cold temperatures trigger her son's asthma. So he keeps having to go to the hospital. She's losing work. He's getting sick. It's a cycle she can't get out of. At some point, she says, I feel like I'm nothing. I'm in charge of paying this rent. The judge had told her she stopped paying her rent because there's no heat. The judge is like, yeah, I mean, that's a different issue. You have to keep paying your rent or you're going to get kicked out. So she says, I'm in charge of paying this rent, but my word is nothing. Because she said to the judge, the living conditions, I have pictures. I have text messages of him saying he doesn't care. I have evidence. She didn't get to show any of that in the courtroom. The judge said, nope, it's not your turn to speak. She didn't have a lawyer. She never got a turn to speak. She feels like she's nothing. She's in charge of paying this rent. Her word is nothing. Her kids' health, the way they live, is nothing. They don't care. They don't care. Right? And this is something that people like Aria are experiencing individually, but it's also something that they're recognizing has a structural component, right? In that same courtroom, that same day with Aria, I sat there and I watched her and a bunch of other mostly Black women, even though this is upstate New York and there aren't even that many of us, okay? You can go someplace where the population is 90% white, go to housing court, it's gonna be mostly Black and brown women, right? And like I was when I sat there for several hours before I talked to Aria, watching, she was watching too. And she said, why doesn't the judge recognize how many people this landlord has at the court? We can't all be the problem, right? They don't live in the same neighborhood. They don't live on the same street, in the same building. They don't know anything about each other. And they're all reporting the same issues. And the judge is handing down these individual verdicts. You know, you have to pay the rent. You have to. Why can't he see? Why can't he see that something structural is going on here? And why can't there be a structural response? So why can't the landlord be subpoenaed and taken to court? What about the slumlords? How come they can't be held to account? And for the judge to sit here and hear all this and address it the way he addressed it, she doesn't say this, but address it like it's an individual problem as opposed to a structural one. It forces us to basically, I'm fighting to take care of my kids. And I can't tell you how many people like Aria I talked to who were just going through it, right? This is a different woman in a different part of upstate New York, but don't worry, I talk to people all over the country. Also a Black woman. And I had been in conversation with, I call her Quiana, for some time. I met her through a local housing assistance organization, and she stayed in touch with me. Her son had been exposed to lead. She found out about it. When she took him to the doctor said, there's been lead exposure, it must be in your home. She had her home inspected. The EPA, it turned out there was lead exposure. But she wasn't able really to do anything. She was in Section 8 housing. There was a long list. She couldn't move somewhere else. She didn't have the resources to move to private housing without the subsidization of voucher. And so she was stuck living in a home that she knew was poisoning her children without any ability to get the landlord to actually abate the lead, to deal with the problem. And she had talked to code enforcement, she had talked to the EPA, she had talked to the local health department, every official who you might think could help her, and nobody could help her. They could each point her to the other person, but nobody actually helped. She's like, when it comes to the judges, code enforcement, she thinks they should be doing more. She knows she's not the only one going through these situations. In fact, she's not. The neighborhood she lives in, 80% of the black children in that neighborhood are exposed to lead before their 5th birthday. So she has this vague sense, this is structural. This is not me. But then, really, what can we do? What can we do? Tenants like me, we need a voice because we're not being heard. And I talked to a lot of people like Quiana and Aria who felt helpless, hopeless, and weren't sure about a path through which they could make change. And if I just stopped with them, that would be the story, a deficit story, a story about people who have things happening to them and who need to be helped. And maybe we can help them through advocacy, a voice for the voiceless. No, that's not where I'm going. Just to be clear, advocacy is great. No, I'm not saying anything bad about advocacy. But why should somebody be a voice for Quiana and Aria? They have their own voices, and they actually express not only their experiences, but their understanding that there was a structural component to their experiences really well. And they actually advocated for themselves as well as one could, given the limited structural context of these courts. They have a capacity, they have an ability to be their own voice, to exercise their own power, right? Not to have a lobbyist do it for them, not to have somebody stand in for them, but they don't know that, not Aria and Quiana, but their problems actually point to possibilities. Their problems create a basis for organizing them into a larger set of collective actions and strategies that can actually address the situations, the structural challenges that they've identified in their own lives, right? And so in the context of sitting in courts and watching what happened to people like Aria and Quiana over the course of several years, I would encounter tenant organizers. They would come in the court. Often they'd all have the same color shirts on. And they would be, sometimes they wouldn't do much of anything but sit there with the tenants and watch. Sometimes they would do things. They would actively be trying to disrupt and shut down what was happening in the court. Sometimes they were outside of the actual courtroom, and I was asking people when I came out of the courtroom, you want to talk to me and do some research? They were like, you want to figure out how to deal with what's happening to you because it's not just you. You want to work with other people who are going. They were organizing, bringing people into the fold at the courthouse. And I observed them for a while. And I was struck. It was really different when they were in the court versus when they weren't. Like, it felt different. The space felt different. And in fact, there were a few times when I was there, and I would often be, if I was in a city for a week or whatever, I'm observing every day, and so I'd go in the morning, I'd observe all morning, and then I'd go back in the afternoon after lunch break, I'd observe all afternoon. And sometimes in the morning, they might not be there. And so I was in that court, and I watched that judge, and I saw how he dealt with people. And then I'd go back in the afternoon, and now the red shirts or the yellow shirts or the green shirts or the blue shirts, because whatever the group is, they're there. And that judge is acting like a different person. The whole vibe of the courtroom is different. Now, they don't necessarily know that because they weren't there that morning, but I'm like, y'all, you're doing something here. Something is happening, right? And then I started to follow up with some of the people who I did interviews with who actually started engaging these organizations and see what journeys they were on. And they were on a journey. They were going from, I'm so depressed, I don't know what to do, this feels impossible, I just got to pray, I need the Lord, to, we got an action happening next month. We're going to go to the city councilor's house and we're going to get him to pay attention to this ordinance that's going to give us protections that we currently don't have, and so on and so forth. So I was witnessing right in front of me the possibilities. And they were starting with the people who seemed hopeless and moving people out of that space somewhere else. And it was happening through organizing. And organizing is not a new phenomenon. Many people have been studying it for many years. There's a lot of great research out there that tells us exactly what it is, right? And it is actually a really systematic, and I would say in many ways, this is a word organizers themselves use. They don't use it in the same way we do, but they use it in a particular way. Rigorous method. In other words, there's a way to do it, and it works. It works. And the focus of organizing is building power in the communities where it does not exist. Sometimes you also organize to break power, concentrated power, oligarchic power, elite power. And building and breaking power are two sides of a coin. When you build power in marginalized communities, those folks can exercise that power to break concentrated and elite power, right? And of course, that can lead to policy change, and that's often the goal, but policy is downstream from power. So often policy is the first place we look. Oh, we got to change the policy, and that'll help all the people who are subject to the things happening to them. Well, sometimes we change the policy and don't even get implemented. Sometimes we change the policy and it doesn't help people in the way we thought it would help them. But when those people have power, then that gets addressed, right? And the policy itself is more reflective of their needs. So policy is there. It's one of the goals that people who are organizing on the ground have, but it's downstream. And structural change is even deeper. Well, how's policy different than structural change? Well, policy is important. It's about a sort of output that shapes many of the ways that people will live their lives. But the processes that shape how that policy gets determined and that shapes how it gets implemented and so on and so forth, now, those are even at a deeper structural level. Organizing is about people actually building the power to be able to change those things, right? And there are a number of different ways that happens. It happens through narrative, shaping narratives, right? Organizing narratives. It happens sometimes by persuading political elites, sometimes by demanding and pressuring those elites, giving them no choice, not just persuading them, but backing them into a corner and forcing them to do something they wouldn't have done otherwise. Sometimes it happens through building massive social movements, although organizing can happen outside of social movements and can be effective outside of social movements. And the key actors in all of this are actually the people who are most affected by the processes that are causing the harms and the disparities that we often tend to focus most on when we're studying these things. And there are specific ways of doing it. It's not just like, I'm gonna go out in the street and go to a protest or go to a rally. Direct actions like that are one facet of organizing, but it's much more strategic than that. It's much more relational than that, less episodic, more long-term. It changes people and then changes their capacities, changes the way they understand who they are and what they're experiencing. So you just thought this was between you and your landlord, and he was doing you dirty. But actually, the reason he can do you dirty is because there's a whole system set up to support him in doing you dirty and to thwart you in being able to push back against that. And so how do you change that, right? That is a shift in how you understand what you're experiencing in the world and what you can do about it. And often when people are brought into organizing circles, that is the shift that happens for them. And it changes their capacity, right? When I talk to organizers, a lot of them, and when I watched organizing campaigns unfold on the ground, the logic really was made concrete for me by folks, right? This is a woman I talked to in Georgia who talks about how her organizing was rooted out of struggles with her own family. She had been evicted 9 times through the course of her life. So she talks about the historical way that housing was used to racialize generations. She could talk about her mother being evicted, her grandmother being evicted, and now as a grown woman with a grown daughter, her daughter was being evicted. This has been happening to us for generations. But eventually she comes to the conclusion that change isn't going to come because they feel they need to do something out of good faith. It's also not going to come because you show them the right evidence. I'll just throw that out there. Not always, right? But the cities are people who have control over these issues are not going to necessarily change anything out of good faith. Change is going to come because we organize really well to make it happen, right? And this is a woman I call Alicia, who I talked to in Georgia. And there are a lot of people like this, right? They're not all black women, even though that's largely who I quote, because they're doing a lot of this work. This is a man from Kentucky, rural Kentucky, a white man, who I call Joe, who talks about a campaign that him and a organizer of his stand up in Kentucky. And they start with this impossible goal of unseating a property management company that the city council and the housing authority had in that role for more than a decade, who was lining their pockets with contributions, a very powerful alliance between this property management company and the powers that be. And at the beginning of the campaign, they were told, this is impossible. Don't even ask for it. You're never going to get it. And they were just some little ragtag hodgepodge group of tenants who were like, this property management company is doing gross harm to people. They need to be removed. And they're being paid, they're being subsidized by the government to harm us. You need to stop this. And they were told, go away. We don't want to listen to you. But what does Joe say? We just kept base building. We kept knocking on doors. We kept building relationships, right? And they grew. They grew their capacity. They also grew their ability to believe that despite what all of the people in power were telling them initially, that they could actually create the change that they wanted to see. And eventually they were able to get to a committee hearing, which itself was a feat. But the key was the strategy. They made sure that that there were a lot of media covering the hearing, and that it was a very public affair, a very public venue. And they told their stories about what this property management company had been doing, which nobody had realized before, quite to the same extent. It put a tremendous amount of pressure on the political elites that had been standing in the way of removing the property management company. And they canceled their contract with the company 4 days after this hearing. What's really interesting about this group is that this was only their first campaign, but because they actually achieved a goal that no one thought they could, it helped them to really convince people it is possible for us to do something. Like, that's just one little property manager in one little city, but they were harming they were harming thousands of black women in public housing specifically. And so if we could do that, we could do more. And this particular group has continued organizing. And it's been about 5 years since this instance with the property management group. The group has grown 5 or 6-fold since then. And they've been able to pass citywide and even statewide legislation, because they built out a statewide group from their local group that we haven't seen like anywhere else in the country, right? So you start small and you build. And I have followed some of these groups now for 6-7 years, watching what they're doing and watching them essentially build power. I'm going to skip that one, from the ground up. I want to end here but I want to say, so a lot of people, when I talk about what I've been seeing and the possibilities for power at the margins, and how a lot of those possibilities lie in organizing the people who are actually experiencing the harms that we track and study and chart and chronicle as researchers, and that there's a way to do that, and that we can not only shine light on that, but we can actually be a part of strengthening that apparatus. I mean, that's hard to make heads or tails of sometimes. It's hard to know what to do with that in the context of who we are as scholars, and we don't all need to be doing the same thing or approaching things in the same way. I think of change as an ecosystem, and different people need to be playing different parts, right? That's why advocacy is important. And research, evidence that you can present to elected officials, it is important. I'm not saying that anyone's role in these systems is irrelevant, but this piece of how do we build power from the ground up for the people who are experiencing the thing, how can our research be a part of that? I think that this piece is a crucial piece, and it's one that has been underattended. It's not to say no one has paid attention to it, but that it's been underattended. When I ask my students when I'm teaching a large lecture course, how does change happen? Nobody says organizing people who don't have power. They might say protests or social movements, so this is this vague abstract thing. But actual the actual work. I've had and this is what I'm going to end with, a positive thing. I've had the real pleasure in the last 3 years of working with a national organization called Community Change on a research project. It's not a traditional research project. And this is funded by a different foundation. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. But, all right, I'm going to get myself in trouble at the end here. But, and the community-based, or the national organization, they're funded, and we're a sub-award. And what we do, though, is they have 15 community-based organizations across the country that are trying to build power in their communities. And our role, our research role as the team at Cornell, is to meet the research needs of those community-based organizations. What do you need to know that is going to allow you to build power in your community? And so I have a team of about 8 people, and we've been working with these groups for 3 years, just doing whatever research they need to change their communities. And we can talk, they have asked us for it's so much harder than I thought it would be, by the way, but also like completely transformative, because they are not asking for anything I would have done otherwise. What they want, what they need is really different from how I think a lot of it we wouldn't even consider research, honestly. There's knowledge, there's information they need, some things that are so easy for us to find out that can help them like really strategize about how to do the work that they need to do. So this power from the ground up, this is not just a comment on what I'm studying. I am studying organizing and how to build power from the ground up. I think it's a comment on one of the ways that we can put our talents to work in exactly the way that Bruce was talking about early on. Like, hey, the Russell Sage Foundation is actually not a foundation that is here to fund social science research. That's what it does, but it's actually here to seed change, right? And really, all of our research is about that in some way or the other. And what I'm finding is really getting clear on exactly how I think that's going to happen. Like, a lot of us are like, somewhere in the ether, our research, it will flow down to the ether and it will create change in the ether somewhere. It's like, okay, how? If your theory of change is, well, through the media, I'm going to shift narrative. Okay, like, how does that actually happen? What is under the hood? If your theory is like evidence-based, I'm gonna get this in front of the right people and they're gonna make the right decisions. Maybe, but how? Like, how do you know that's happening? How do you know who the right people are? Just getting really clear. So for me, I've gotten really clear, like, this is how I think my research is going to translate into fundamental change, by connecting with the people on the ground in communities who are trying to do it anyway, and being a part of their work and following their lead and mapping into their ecosystem. This isn't everything I do. I still have plenty of other kinds of research I do and ways I study things. But this is where I am finding the most promise and possibility in my work. It's where I'm seeing the promise of democracy, and it's coming from the margins. So I'll stop there.
So we have a few minutes for a couple questions.
Yeah.
My name is Fee Sue, and I'd love to build off Marta's question about the kinds of requests that you're getting from community organizations and turn that into a question about the medium through which you're communicating these findings that are often descriptive. And so I'd love to hear about the different kinds of either text-based or non-text-based ways that you're communicating some of the things that they're asking for.
Oh, such a good question, and I can answer it quickly. I mean, so we have a couple of research papers that are coming out of this just because we've collected all this data and done all this work. And for some of the questions that are kind of causal or that lend themselves to like a kind of standard research approach, we're publishing research papers, but relative to the amount of work we put in, like, it's gonna, the ratio of like research paper output to the amount of work and funding that has gone into this project, most of an academic would be like, this is a failure, you know? But the work that, like, what's happening in communities, I'm like, this is the best thing I've ever done with my whole career. But so we should think about that. But what these folks want, we've built microsites that they could use as like a constant resource that they share. Sometimes they're password protected. They share them with everybody in their organizing network. They can go and look at, and maps, they love maps. So a lot of people, they want to know the geographic distribution of this or that pattern across certain spaces so they can think about where to do the work that they're doing. Infographics, short reports, short kind of like memos, things like that. Nobody is like, could you give me a 20-page anything? Nothing. There's not any of that, to be fair. Some folks have actually asked us to show up in their communities and like meet with their members and share the information, like do a talk, do a PowerPoint. I've had some of my students do that. We've had people ask us to show up and do research trainings to show the people in their organizations how to do, because they're like, this grant's gonna end and you're not gonna be doing this for us anymore. Can you help us build our capacity? So I've actually taken some of my students and postdocs and we've gone places and we've done research training with member-based community organizations. Like, look, this is how you get to this census data. This is how you parse it. This is how you read it. This is how you analyze it. This is what you can and can't say with it. So you don't end up saying things that aren't true and then getting, having a foil in your campaign because of that. So.
Last one here.
Right. Hi, Anna Mickelborg. I'm a current grantee. I'm feeling like very called to action. I want to find practitioners in the community who I can work with, but I guess my question is logistical. Could you speak a little bit to how you find practitioners who will be good partners where everybody benefits, and what advice would you give to junior scholars who want to start doing this kind of work?
Yeah, first I will say this. I'm not telling you to do anything. This was not a prescriptive talk. And also I guess, for junior folks, what I would say is like pace yourself. Like, this is actually not what I was doing as a first year or second year or third year or assistant professor. And I don't know that it should have been. Although I was doing sort of the work that was the groundwork for this, or versions of this, I was always looking for ways of bringing my work into the world in ways that went beyond me, and always looking for what was happening in communities that were relevant to me. So first I would say just be aware and look for opportunities. I wouldn't necessarily force them, like, I gotta go in the community and find a practitioner. Sometimes that could hit different for that person in the community, like, oh, now you feel like you gotta do something and I'm your target, And so on the one hand, I wanna say, like, to allow yourself to grow organically as a scholar and to, be in, like, who do you want to be in community with? What do you care about that your research relates to, that you have some set of skills that you can bring? And can you place yourself in community with people and just be there without being the researcher just yet, and learn and observe and be present? And when you're present in that way, that you will see what you can do and where you can do it. And there will be no shortage of, actually, I'm, very overwhelmed. So you want to try not to get yourself there, and pace yourself, right? Because if you're not a researcher, if you don't have a job, if you don't have access to the kinds of skills and capacities that we can offer to community groups, then you don't have that to offer, right? And so you also want to thrive in your career. You shouldn't feel bad for that. Like, oh no, I'm just publishing papers. I should be out here in the community. Well, you're not a community organizer. You're a researcher. That's your path. That's how you're going to make whatever offering that you make. So lean into that and doing that excellently and well, but also look for where you can be expanding beyond that. And if you look, I know this sounds super cheesy, but I just have never seen it not be true. If you look, you will find this. It's not like hard, Yeah. Thanks.